Emma had always been the quieter one in her family, while her younger sister, Lily, shone like a star, confident, charming, and effortlessly loved by everyone. Emma preferred to stay in the background. She wasn't jealous of Lily, she admired her. But deep down, Emma often wondered if anyone ever noticed her at all. So, when the invitation to Lily's wedding arrived in the mail, Emma felt a mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling inside her. This was Lily's big day, and Emma wanted nothing more than to celebrate it with joy and pride. The envelope itself was beautiful, a creamy white card with gold lettering that read, "You're invited." Emma traced her fingers over the words, imagining how much effort Lily must have put into planning every detail. The ceremony would take place at a picturesque garden venue outside the city, followed by an elegant reception under twinkling fairy lights. It sounded magical, just like something out of a movie. For weeks leading up to the event, Emma threw herself into preparations. She bought a new dress, a soft lavender gown that complemented her fair skin, and practiced smiling for photos, so she wouldn't look awkward in the family pictures. But as the days passed, tiny moments began chipping away at Emma's excitement. Her mother called one evening to ask what color her dress was. When Emma told her, there was a long pause before her mom said, "Are you sure that shade suits you? Maybe something brighter would be better." Emma forced a laugh, brushing it off as typical maternal concern, but the comment lingered in her mind. A few days later, during a casual conversation with her dad, he joked about how Emma was the quiet type who might not even dance at the wedding. Again, Emma smiled and shrugged it off, though a small part of her wondered why her family seemed to define her solely by her silence. Despite these moments, Emma refused to let negativity overshadow Lily's special day. She reminded herself that weddings were stressful, and maybe her family didn't mean anything by their remarks. Besides, this wasn't about her. It was about Lily starting a new chapter in her life. Emma decided to focus on making the day memorable for her sister, even if it meant putting her own feelings aside. On the morning of the wedding, Emma woke up early, buzzing with anticipation. She carefully styled her hair, slipped into her lavender dress, and added a delicate necklace her grandmother had given her years ago. As she stood in front of the mirror, she whispered to herself, "Today is Lily's day. Just enjoy it." With that thought firmly planted in her mind, Emma headed to the venue, ready to witness her sister walk down the aisle and begin her happily ever after. Little did she know, the events of the day would leave her questioning far more than just her place in the family photo. When Emma arrived at the wedding venue, she was immediately struck by how breathtaking it looked. The garden was alive with vibrant flowers in full bloom, their colors glowing softly under the morning sun. Strings of fairy lights hung delicately from tree branches, swaying gently in the breeze as if they were dancing along with the excitement in the air. Tables draped in pristine white linens stood neatly arranged, each adorned with elegant centerpieces made of fresh roses and greenery. It truly felt like a dream come true. For Lily. Emma parked her car and took a deep breath before stepping out, smoothing down her lavender dress one last time. She had arrived early, hoping to lend a hand with any last-minute preparations. As she walked toward the main area, she spotted her mother directing a team of florists while juggling a clipboard and a phone. Her dad was nearby, chatting animatedly, with some relatives who had already shown up. Everyone seemed busy, caught up in the whirlwind of activity that came with pulling off such a grand event. "Mom!" Emma called out cheerfully, waving as she approached. Her mother turned around, gave her a quick once-over, and frowned slightly. "Oh, you're here," she said, not unkindly but without much warmth either. "We've got everything under control, dear. Why don't you go find your seat? They've started setting up the seating chart." Emma hesitated, feeling a pang of disappointment. She had hoped to help, to feel useful somehow, but instead of pushing back, she nodded and forced a smile. "Sure thing," she replied lightly. "Let me know if you need anything." Her mother barely acknowledged her response, already turning back to instruct the florists about rearranging a bouquet. Wandering over to where the seating chart was displayed, Emma scanned the list of names written in elegant calligraphy. At first glance, everything seemed normal until she found her own name. To her surprise, she wasn't seated at the family table near Lily, her parents, or even her cousins. Instead, her name appeared on a completely different table, tucked away in a corner of the room next to people she barely recognized, distant acquaintances, friends of friends, and colleagues of Lily's fiancé whom Emma had never met. Confusion washed over her. Surely this had to be a mistake. She glanced around, spotting her mother again, and hurried over. "Mom," she began hesitantly, pointing to the chart, "I think there might be an error with the seating. I'm at table 12. Isn't that supposed to be for family?" Her mother waved a dismissive hand, barely looking up from her clipboard. "Oh, don't worry about that. We just thought it would be nice to mix things up a bit. You'll have fun meeting new people." Emma blinked, unsure of what to say. Mix things up? Wasn't a wedding supposed to be a time when families came together? She tried to push aside the uneasy feeling growing in her chest. Maybe her mom was right. It could be interesting to sit with strangers. Besides, she reminded herself, today wasn't about her. It was about Lily. Still, as she wandered back toward the seating chart, she couldn't shake the nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. The hours passed quickly, and soon guests began arriving in droves. Emma watched as her family greeted everyone warmly, laughing and hugging as though they hadn't seen each other in years. From afar, she noticed how effortlessly Lily glided through the crowd, radiant in her wedding gown, stopping to chat with every guest. Even her parents looked thrilled, basking in the glow of their daughter's big day. But no one stopped to talk to Emma. No one asked how she was doing or complimented her dress. She stood quietly to the side, observing the scene unfold, feeling more and more like an outsider with each passing moment. When the ceremony began, she slipped into her designated seat at table 12, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. As the bride and groom exchanged vows, Emma clapped politely, trying to focus on the beauty of the moment. Yet deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing emptiness inside her, a quiet ache that whispered louder than anyone else's laughter. As the ceremony unfolded, Emma tried her best to stay present. She focused on the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the gentle hum of violins playing in the background, and the heartfelt vows being exchanged between Lily and her new husband. It was a beautiful moment, one that should have filled her with joy, but no matter how hard she concentrated, the nagging feeling of isolation refused to fade. From her seat at table 12, Emma could see her family clearly, laughing, chatting, and sharing inside jokes. Her father leaned back in his chair, gesturing animatedly as he told a story that made everyone burst into laughter. Her mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, overcome with emotion as she watched her youngest daughter take this monumental step. Even her cousins, who rarely spoke to her, seemed deeply engaged in conversation, their heads tilted close together as they whispered and giggled. Emma glanced around her own table and felt a sharp contrast. The people seated nearby were strangers, exchanging polite small talk about topics like traffic and weather. One man scrolled through his phone without looking up, while another woman seemed more interested in rearranging the silverware than engaging with anyone. When Emma attempted to join in by commenting on how lovely the venue looked, the response was lukewarm, a quick nod or a mumbled, "Yes, it's nice," before silence settled over them again. The disconnection weighed heavily on her. She had always known she wasn't the center of attention in her family, but today it felt like she didn't exist at all. The seating arrangement wasn't just inconvenient. It was symbolic. It reinforced everything she'd secretly feared for years, that she was invisible, unimportant, expendable. Things took a turn for the worse during dinner. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, serving plates of gourmet food. As one waiter approached Emma's table balancing a tray laden with dishes, he stumbled slightly. Before anyone could react, a glass of red wine tipped over, spilling directly onto Emma's lavender dress. The room seemed to freeze for a split second as gasps echoed around her table. Mortified, Emma jumped to her feet, grabbing a napkin to blot at the spreading stain. "I'm so sorry," the waiter stammered, his face pale with panic. "Let me get something to clean it." "It's fine," Emma muttered quickly, though it clearly wasn't. The damage was done. The delicate fabric now bore a dark crimson mark that would never fully come out. People at nearby tables turned to stare, some offering sympathetic smiles, others whispering behind their hands. At her own table, no one offered help or even said a word. They simply watched as Emma stood there, clutching the stained napkin, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. That was the final straw. Every ounce of composure Emma had been clinging to shattered in an instant. Without thinking, she grabbed her purse and bolted from the table, weaving through clusters of guests until she reached the edge of the garden. Once outside, she leaned against a tree, taking deep breaths to steady herself. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let herself cry. For several minutes, Emma stood there, trying to process what had just happened. She replayed the events of the day in her mind, the dismissive comments from her mom, the lonely table assignment, the spilled wine, and realized something painful. None of this was accidental. This was how her family saw her, not as someone integral to their lives, but as someone who could easily be pushed aside without consequence. Her chest tightened with anger and hurt, but beneath those emotions lay a flicker of determination. Enough was enough. She couldn't continue pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. For once, she needed to prioritize herself. With that thought solidifying in her mind, Emma straightened up, wiped her damp palms on her dress, and walked briskly toward the parking lot. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving. She didn't owe them an explanation. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. Not tonight, not like this. Emma's car sat quietly in the parking lot, its metallic surface glinting faintly under the dim light of a nearby lamppost. She slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she tried to steady her breathing. Her heart raced, not just from the rush of emotions, but from the weight of what had just happened. Leaving the wedding felt like stepping out of a foggy room into crisp, cold air. For the first time in hours, she could think clearly. At first, she considered driving straight home, locking herself in her apartment, and letting the night fade away. But as she sat there, staring at the empty road ahead, another thought crept into her mind. What if this is my chance? All those years of swallowing her feelings, of staying silent while others overlooked her. What had it gotten her? A stained dress, an empty chair at a forgotten table, and a hollow ache that refused to go away. Instead of starting the engine, Emma reached for her phone. She opened the Notes app and began typing furiously, her fingers flying across the screen. At first, the words came out messy and disjointed, fragments of frustration, hurt, and longing. But slowly, they started to take shape. She wrote about how much she loved Lily, how proud she was of her sister for finding happiness, and how desperately she wanted to be part of a family that celebrated together. Then she shifted gears, pouring out everything she'd kept bottled up for so long. The feeling of being invisible, the constant comparisons to Lily, the quiet pain of never quite measuring up. As she typed, something remarkable happened. The anger bubbling inside her began to soften, replaced by a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about tonight. It was about years of unspoken truths. And now, sitting alone in her car with nothing but the hum of crickets in the background, Emma realized she finally had the courage to say them aloud. When she finished writing, she read the note over twice, tweaking sentences here and there until it felt right. It wasn't perfect. Her hand still trembled slightly as she scrolled through the lines, but it was honest. Honest in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in years. Satisfied, she saved the draft and leaned back against the seat, exhaling deeply, But leaving couldn't be the end of the story. Not yet. If she drove away now, nothing would change. Her family might notice her absence briefly, maybe even feel guilty for a moment, but life would move on as usual. No one would understand why she left unless she told them, and telling them meant going back. The idea terrified her. What if they laughed it off? What if they dismissed her words the same way they dismissed her all evening? Worse still, what if they got defensive or angry? But then she remembered something important. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about her, about standing up for herself, even if it scared her, even if it meant risking rejection. With newfound resolve, Emma started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, but not toward home. Instead, she drove to a cozy little cafe a few blocks away, a place she often visited when she needed space to think. The barista greeted her warmly, recognizing her as a regular, and handed her a steaming cup of tea without asking. Emma thanked him with a small smile and settled into her favorite corner booth. For the next 20 minutes, she sipped her tea and rehearsed what she would say when she returned to the wedding. She imagined walking back into the reception hall, her heels clicking against the polished floor, drawing curious glances from guests who had barely noticed her earlier. She pictured herself stepping up to the microphone during open mic time, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. Most importantly, she envisioned saying the words that had been locked away in her heart for far too long. By the time she drained the last drop of tea from her cup, Emma knew exactly what she needed to do. She paid her bill, thanked the barista again, and headed back to her car. As she drove toward the venue, determination coursed through her veins. Tonight wouldn't end with silence. Tonight she would make sure her voice was heard, even if it shocked everyone. When Emma returned to the wedding venue, the atmosphere inside was electric. The reception had shifted into full swing, with upbeat music pulsing through the air and guests twirling on the dance floor under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights. Laughter echoed off the walls, mingling with the clinking of glasses and the occasional burst of applause. On the surface, it looked like a perfect celebration, exactly what a wedding should be. But as Emma stepped inside, her presence went unnoticed, at first. She hovered near the entrance, clutching her phone tightly in one hand, her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if others could hear it too. Her lavender dress still bore the dark stain from earlier, a stark reminder of everything that had led her to leave. Yet now, standing there with her speech saved on her phone, she felt different. Calmer, stronger, ready. The DJ's voice boomed over the speakers, announcing that it was time for open mic speeches. "If anyone wants to share a few words about the happy couple," he said cheerfully, "now's your chance." A few people cheered and several guests glanced around expectantly, waiting to see who would step forward. Some The applause that followed Emma's speech was overwhelming, but it wasn't universal. While many guests clapped enthusiastically, some faces in the crowd remained frozen, shocked, confused, or even defensive. Emma stepped back from the microphone, her heart racing as she looked out at the sea of reactions. Her parents sat rigidly at their table, their expressions unreadable, while Lily jumped up from her seat and rushed toward her sister. "Emma!" Lily exclaimed, throwing her arms around her in a tight hug. "I had no idea you felt this way. I'm so sorry." Her voice cracked slightly, and tears welled up in her eyes. "You're my sister. You should have been sitting right next to me. None of this should have happened." Emma hugged her back, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "It's okay," she whispered, though her voice wavered. I needed to say something. For once, I wanted to be honest about how I feel." Lily pulled back slightly, holding Emma by the shoulders and looking her in the eye. "Thank you for saying it," she said firmly, "and thank you for coming back. You belong here, with me, with us, always." As Lily returned to her seat, still dabbing at her eyes, other guests began approaching Emma. Some offered kind words, telling her how brave she was for speaking up. A few even admitted they'd noticed her absence earlier and wondered why she'd left. One older woman, a distant relative Emma barely remembered, patted her hand and said, "You spoke for all of us who sometimes feel overlooked. Don't ever doubt your worth, dear." But not everyone reacted warmly. Emma's mother stood abruptly from her chair, her face flushed with embarrassment, or perhaps anger, and marched over to where Emma stood. "What on earth were you thinking?" she hissed under her breath, glancing nervously at the surrounding guests. "This isn't the time or place for this kind of drama." Emma blinked, taken aback by her mother's tone. For a moment she considered retreating into silence again, letting the comment slide like she always did. But then she remembered the hours she'd spent rehearsing her speech, the courage it had taken to step back into that room. She straightened her posture and met her mother's gaze squarely. "I wasn't trying to cause drama, Mom," she replied calmly, though her voice carried an edge she rarely used. "I was being honest, and if we can't talk about things like this, even at a wedding, then when can we?" Her mother opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Emma's father interjected. He placed a gentle hand on his wife's arm and gave Emma a long, thoughtful look. "Maybe we should listen to what she's saying," he suggested quietly. "She's right. It's not just about today. We need to do better." For the first time that evening, Emma saw a flicker of understanding in her father's eyes. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase years of feeling sidelined, but it was a start. Slowly, the tension in the room began to ease as more people joined the conversation. Friends and relatives shared stories of their own struggles with family dynamics, creating a sense of connection Emma hadn't expected. Even her mother softened slightly, though she remained quiet, clearly processing everything that had been said. As the initial shock wore off, the reception resumed its celebratory tone, but something had shifted. The energy in the room felt lighter, more genuine. Guests mingled with renewed enthusiasm, and several people made a point of including Emma in their conversations. Someone even asked her to dance, pulling her onto the floor for a lively number that brought laughter and cheers from those watching. Through it all, Emma couldn't help but notice how different she felt. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not tonight, anyway. By speaking her truth, she had carved out a space for herself in a world that often seemed determined to overlook her. And while she knew this wouldn't magically fix everything overnight, it was enough to give her hope. Enough to remind her that her voice mattered, and that sometimes honesty was the bravest thing you could offer. The ripple effect of Emma's speech spread far beyond the immediate applause. As the night wore on, whispers buzzed through the crowd like a gentle current, carrying fragments of her words to every corner of the venue. Some guests were visibly moved, wiping away tears as they recounted parts of her speech to one another. Others nodded thoughtfully, reflecting on their own relationships with family and friends. It was clear that Emma's courage had struck a chord, not just with her family, but with everyone in attendance. At first, her parents struggled to process what had happened. They retreated to a quiet corner of the room, huddled together in low, urgent tones. Her mother still looked flustered, glancing repeatedly at Emma as if unsure how to approach her. Her father, however, seemed more contemplative, his brow furrowed, as he replayed her words in his mind. After several minutes of tense discussion, he finally stood up and walked over to where Emma was now sitting with Lily and a few other relatives. "Emma," he began hesitantly, pulling up a chair beside her. His voice was softer than usual, almost tentative. I want you to know that your mother and I never meant to make you feel left out. We didn't realize how much it hurt you." Emma met his gaze, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. For years, she'd assumed her feelings were invisible to them, or worse, dismissed as unimportant. But now, seeing the uncertainty in her father's eyes, she realized something profound. Maybe they hadn't noticed. Maybe her silence had allowed them to overlook her pain because she'd never given them a reason to look closer. "I appreciate you saying that," Emma replied carefully, choosing her words with care. But it's not just about tonight. It's about all the little things. Comments, decisions, moments that add up over time. I've spent so long feeling like I don't matter, and tonight made me realize I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. Her father nodded slowly, his expression heavy with regret. You're right, he admitted. We should have paid more attention. And we will, from now on. Nearby, Emma's mother watched the exchange silently, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked conflicted, torn between defensiveness and guilt. When her husband waved her over, she hesitated before joining them, sinking into the chair next to him with obvious reluctance. Emma, her mother started, her voice strained. I'm sorry if we've made you feel this way. That was never our intention. She paused, searching for the right words. You're my daughter, and I love you. But sometimes I forget that loving someone isn't enough. You have to show it too. Emma felt a pang of emotion at her mother's admission. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, Emma saw vulnerability in her mother's eyes. In that moment, she understood that her parents weren't perfect. They were human, just like her, and while their mistakes had hurt her deeply, they were capable of growth, if she gave them the chance. As the evening continued, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Guests who had barely acknowledged Emma earlier went out of their way to include her in conversations. One cousin even joked about how brave she was, earning a round of laughter that eased the lingering tension. Even the distant acquaintances at table 12 sought her out to apologize for being so aloof during dinner. By the end of the night, Emma found herself smiling genuinely for the first time that day. The wedding hadn't turned out the way she'd expected, but perhaps that was a good thing. Instead of blending into the background, she had stepped into the spotlight, not to overshadow Lily, but to remind everyone that every person deserves to be seen and valued. When the final song played, and the reception drew to a close, Lily pulled Emma aside for one last hug. Thank you for coming back, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And thank you for speaking up. You showed me, and all of us, what really matters. Emma hugged her sister tightly, feeling a warmth in her chest that hadn't been there before. I'll always come back for you, Lil, she murmured. Just promise me one thing. Next time, let's sit at the same table, okay? Lily laughed softly, tears shining in her eyes. Deal. As Emma walked away from the venue later that night, she realized something important. While the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, tonight had marked the beginning of something new. A chance to rebuild, reconnect, and rediscover her place within her family and herself. In the weeks that followed Lily's wedding, Emma noticed subtle yet significant changes in her family dynamics. It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were still moments of awkwardness and lingering tension, but the cracks had started to mend. For the first time in years, Emma felt like her voice mattered. Her parents began reaching out more often, calling just to check in or inviting her over for casual dinners where conversations flowed freely instead of feeling forced. Her mother, who had always been quick with unsolicited advice, made a conscious effort to listen instead. During one visit, she surprised Emma by saying, I've been thinking about what you said at the wedding, about showing love, not just saying it. She paused, looking down at her hands before meeting Emma's gaze. So I got you something. She handed Emma a small box wrapped